All right, welcome to the second virtual uh, roundtable. I would call it a virtual conference, of the E4M DNP dialogues. Earlier, some days back, we had the first conversation in our two-part series, which will culminate into a physical event in the early 2023. We have seen a lot of churn happening in the media landscape when it comes to the equation between tech platforms and publishers. Uh, there are big changes happening globally, and of course, in India as well. There are changes happening in the media landscape when it comes to the equation between tech platforms and publishers.
Somebody from E4M should look into it because Taylor has joined. Hi.
Hello.
Um, Apologies for this tech glitch. I know the network is acting up here. But anyway, I can see Mr. Owens here has joined us. So we have an eclectic panel. I'll just reintroduce my speakers. Professor Taylor Owen, Beaverbrook Chair in Media, Ethics and Communication, and Associate Professor, Max Bell School of Public Policy, McGill University. We have Mr. Paul Deegan, President and Chief Executive, uh, News Media Canada. We have Dr. Courtney Reg, Fellow UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. We have Mr. Avinash Pandey, CEO ABP Network, and Mr. Puneet Jain, CEO HT Digital. Before I proceed, I want to hand over the first the baton to my first speaker, Mr. Avinash Pandey, CEO, ABP Network. Briefly, I want to talk about Mr. Pandey. He's the CEO of ABP Network, which runs 6 news channels, 10 digital channels, and a successful film production company, ABP Studios. He's also the president of News Broadcasters and Digital Association, NBDA. Welcome, Mr. Pandey. Over to you.
Thank you, Roel. Am I audible?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow travelers of the digital universe. It is indeed my pleasure to be here today to open up this dialogue on the scope of ideal relationship between digital news publishers and the big tech platforms, and how, more importantly, the nature of this relationship can impact the field of journalism as a whole. As most of you notably know, that about 4 years ago, DNPA, or Digital News Publisher Association, was launched with an aim to define, create, and foster the emerging digital news ecosystem. It represents 17 leading media houses of the country, which contributes to almost 80% of the digital news content. It was and remains a necessity because the digital explosion in this country has led to a definitive shift in the ways what news and current affairs information is consumed in this space. And along with this consumption shift has come a scramble of revenue where digital news publishers have to contend and compete with the twin challenges. On the one side is the fake news, and on the other side, there are self-publishing media houses. The tussle of revenue has also been lopsided with the tech platforms who are not agreeable to a fair sharing of revenue with the actual publishers who are publishing daily verified news content. The lacuna exists even in the eyes of the big tech individuals on the social media and the bona fide digital news publishing houses where content is not differentiated. But the traditional news services too are no longer monoliths that can ignore the democratization of the news dissemination. And today, more than ever, news publishers and tech platforms have to collaborate to meet the insatiable demand for information. In this setting, the role of the DNPA in looking for solution and advocating dialogues assumes a significance that goes beyond the commercial nature of the aspect, because the test we face and the solutions we define what the nature of journalism is going to be in the time to come. The DNPA is naturally at the forefront of the changes that is coming in our way in the quality of journalism. Publishers are seeking a level playing field and between themselves and the tech platform. The aim here is to create a more sustainable foundation for the preservation of high quality journalism. A few countries, some of my colleagues who are present here, have already brought legislation to force this issue. Government of India has also started hinting at a possible legislation that would be very conducive for tech platform to negotiate a balance between the publishers, traditional publishers, and the tech platforms. It is particularly to address this, and we are here at the second edition of DNPA Dialogue with some of the best international thought leaders of the day to discuss the issue involved in creating an ideal relationship between the news publisher and tech platforms in rebuilding the business of journalism. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pandey, for sharing your initial thoughts. And now I would like to invite Mr. Puneet Jain to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Jain is the CEO of HT Digital News, responsible for growing HT Media's overall presence in digital.
So I think Puneet, you can
I think some sure. I'll get started. Good evening, everyone. Once again, welcome to this inaugural edition of DNPA Dialogues. I am Puneet Jain, CEO HT Digital. DNPA Dialogues aim to foster an open discussion among various stakeholders in the news ecosystem in India, from publishers to government to regulators, big tech, and of course our users. The theme of today's conversation is the relationship between big tech and digital news publishers and how it impacts journalism in the country. Under this theme, we had the first dialogue last week where we had subject matter experts from Australia sharing their perspective and progress they have made in their relationship with big tech. Continuing from the same, today we are excited to have guests from Canada and US. On that note, let me, without further ado, let me invite Mr. Taylor Owen, who is the director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. He's also the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communication and Associate Professor in the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. So, Mr. Taylor, look forward to an engaging conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. And Paul and Courtney, it's nice to be here with you guys too. So look, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about what's been going on in Canada regarding this latest piece of public policy addressed at journalism. Paul, I'm sure, can go into it in more detail, but I thought I could just kind of sketch the landscape in which it was introduced, how it's differed a little bit from the Australian model, which you talked about last week, and how some of the debate has played out about it in Canada. Because I think it's quite telling how various actors have responded to the introduction of this bill in Canada. But first, I think there's some attributes. I mean, obviously, every journalism ecosystem has similarities and differences. And a couple of things are important at the moment in the Canadian media ecosystem that are relevant to I think, the tabling of this bill and how it's being received. One is, of course, just the decline in Canadian news publishers that we're seeing in other markets. I mean, there's nothing particularly unique about the Canadian news market, except that it has been a more difficult space for independents and digital companies to emerge than I would argue the US, in part because of the nature of digital commercial models for journalism that demand a certain kind of scale that Canada just hasn't been able to match. So we've seen a real decline in publishers, both legacy and more broadly, and not the same kind of digital ecosystem replace that market as you have in some other places. Second reality is that in response to the Australian bargaining code, the tech platforms in Canada have entered into deals with some Canadian publishers. These deals are unknown to the public. They're behind NDAs, and they are with some publishers and not all of them at the discretion of the platforms. Some of them are general, from what we know, are general licensing agreements or payment deals. Some are programmatic in that the platforms actually have some say in what kind of content is produced with those funds. So one of the baseline realities in Canada is not a world in which there are no deals between publishers and platforms, but actually where there are opaque and unaccountable deals between platforms and some publishers. And that's actually a really important piece of the reality, I think, when we assess the Canadian version of the Online News Act. The final piece is that there actually is already existing policy from the federal government to assist journalism as well. So in 2019, the federal government introduced 4 mechanisms. They expanded our charitable status to apply to journalistic organizations. They gave a subscription tax credit to offset some of the costs of subscriptions. There's a fund for local journalism, and perhaps most importantly to this conversation, there is a labor tax subsidy on journalistic labor for qualifying journalism organizations. And this is 25% of journalistic labor can be offset through a tax subsidy, which is actually a fairly significant mechanism, which I'm happy to talk more about as well. Okay, so a few quick differences between the labor with the Australian code. Rather than explaining all the details of the act here, let me say a few things about how it's different than Australia, since you guys talked about that last week. The first big one is that it's overseen by a regulator rather than a competition commissioner. So it is a very similar model to Australia, sort of the forced arbitration mechanism, but it is overseen by our broadcast regulator rather than through the lens of a competition bureau. And I think this actually both complicates it and opens up a whole host of regulatory mechanisms, one of which is a far more detailed exemption criteria. So one of the real critiques of the Australian code was that the mechanism for exempting from designation was very crude and ill-defined. We do not know the terms on which that decision was made. And that's actually the biggest piece of this entire policy initiative, is that moment of decision of exemption from designation is the one big piece of policy policy intervention that the government has. And so what the Canadian bill has done is put specified criteria on that exemption. And they include fair compensation, so everybody's getting some sort of similar amount, that the money get used for local regional news and regional news content, some degree of journalistic independence inside the deals, like written into the deals, that a significant portion of the deals go to independent publishers, and that there's a degree of diversity of all kinds in terms of the distribution of these deals across the country, language, regional, ethnic diversity. So that's a very important thing that I actually think is going to be mimicked by other countries who may or follow sort of similar policy paths. A few other quick differences. The bill has defined what a qualifying journalistic organization is, going down quite small, and that's now being amended to be even smaller. One proprietor and one full-time journalist. This creates all sorts of challenges, which we can talk about. There is greater transparency built into the Canadian bill than the Australian one. This is tricky because while many people have asked for full transparency of these deals, given that they're mandated by a piece of public policy, one could maybe expect that they be fully transparent. On the other hand, these are deals between two commercial actors, and there are a host of legal and particularly trade restrictions on forcing transparency of market information. So what the Canadian bill has done essentially said that the regulator needs to have access to the details of the deals. This is not the case in Australia, to its detriment, I would argue. The regulator uses that information about those deals to do two things: to, if it ends up in forced arbitration, in order to see the fairness of the deals compared to others, right? To evaluate the best offers from the two parties, they need access to the deals that other people have received, so they'll have that. And also, more importantly, to adjudicate whether a platform will be designated or not. So they will get access to all of the suite of deals that have been done, and they can see if they meet those exemption criteria. All of this then gets reported in some degree of frequency. It's being debated right now to the public in an aggregated way. So the public has like some sense of where money's flowing, how, and under what conditions. Finally, two other things quickly. There's an accountability mechanism, I think, that makes it somewhat more accountable than the Australian bill. Some of the designation hearings, some part of that process is going to be held in public. So this is going to be something that Canadian citizens are going to get this window into the arguments of both sides. And designation is not a permanent status. It's something that can be reviewed, which I think is really important. Finally, publishers, we do have a collective bargaining component of this as well, but different from Australia, publishers can join collectives after they've been formed and entered into deals. So this, I think, opens ideally the model up to many more publishers who may not be involved in the initial negotiations for deals. Okay, so that's kind of different to Australia. So how's this played out in Canada? Let me just sort of close with a few comments on that. So it's been I think it's quite instructive and tells us a lot about both this policy lever and how different players in this debate see it. So Google has used, in my view, and these are my personal beliefs here, in my view, a strategy that sought to divide publishers against each other in response to this bill. So they have been engaging with and supporting networks of small and independent publishers, and with them making the argument that this bill will disproportionately advantage the large publishers and legacy publishers. I think there's a reasonable debate about that. I think many of the facts on which they are making that debate are wrong and are not reflected in the bill. I think Paul can probably speak to this in more detail than I can. But in my view, it's quite telling about the role they see themselves having in this ecosystem, that really they are fostering what has become quite a acrimonious debate between journalistic publishers, which is a pretty unfortunate consequence of the debate we've had in the last year in Canada over this bill. Facebook has done essentially what they threatened to do in Australia and are threatening to do in the US as well, which is to turn off access to news links on their site should the bill come to pass. They have made this in public and in front of parliamentary committee in Canada, so it seems like an official position. We can talk about what the consequences of that are. My view is I'm not sure it's possible. I think it may be possible in one market with a small set of publishers. I'm not convinced of the logistics, let alone the strategy of doing it in multiple markets around the world, and how that would even be possible. But that's the threat. It's on the table. Another reaction, which has been interesting, and I think shows you some of the, goes back to that one of that initial points I made, which was that some publishers have deals, is some publishers who have deals have no longer have the same kind of support they may have once had for this piece of public policy, which actually I think shows you the reason why those deals were put in place in the first place. If one has a deal with Facebook or Google that it lasts some number of years, and that puts you at an advantage over your competitors who do not have them, you might be less likely to support a policy that will democratize or open up access to the very same deal you have. And we've seen that, which is pretty unfortunate in my view, for a host of reasons. And I think actually the publishers and Google in this case particularly are to blame for this end result. The two final sort of reflections on where we are in Canada. Like, this bill's going to pass in my view in the new year. It will come into effect. And Paul will have some clear ideas for when, but I do think it's going to happen. It's in committee right now, and there's some debates over some details of it, and there'll be more debates in our Senate in the new year. But I think it's highly likely to pass. Two broad sort of reflections about that. One is we will likely be in a situation in Canada where close to 50% of journalistic labor is subsidized by either the federal government through the labor tax subsidy or platforms through this code. And that to me is not an ideal situation. And that is, so the next big public policy challenge in Canada for journalism is going to be what you do about that, and what effect that is having on the journalistic market, and how do we move beyond that. This might be an okay stopgap measure for an industry that's in real decline, but it is not a permanent solution and is not one we should want. And we need to sort of be clear about that. The second is a final comment about the reaction of the platforms to the Canadian debate. And this, I think, ties into the Indian conversation too. I don't think Facebook or Google care about the Canadian market in any sort of significant way. Canada imposing this code will cost some number of hundreds of millions of dollars, which both companies can easily absorb. But they are fighting the bill in Canada incredibly aggressively, particularly Google, which is, I think, behaving in a way that they are not either accustomed or particularly happy about doing, frankly. They're not acting like a responsible policy actor in Canada at the moment, in my view. And I think they're fighting it so aggressively, not because of Canada, because the Canadian bill actually builds and makes the Australian bill better. And it shows that there's a degree of policy iteration in this space happening, where governments are starting to learn from each other. And my view is this model could really take off in the next year. So in part, because it is getting better and the governments are addressing some of the problems with the original Australian code, which in my view did have some fundamental problems. So in closing, I don't think Google cares and Facebook care about the Canadian market and 40 million people in Canada. But if in the next year, South Africa, Germany, the UK, Brazil, and others potentially all implement a similar policy, that really does start to matter. You're then in a universe where there's 1 billion or 2 billion people under some sort of similar policy framework. And you better believe that matters. And that could lead to billions of dollars of transfer from publishers, from platforms to publishers, which makes me feel like if that's going to happen, we better ensure that the mechanism through which that money is being transferred from these large platforms to publishers is done so in a way that is as accountable and democratic as possible. Because that's where our attention should focus, is on ensuring these bills have accountability, transparency, and some degree of democratic legitimacy built into them. And I think the Canadian one gets that, moves that ball forward a little bit.
Taylor, I have a question.
Yeah.
if I may go. You mentioned something very interesting. You said that, what essentially Google seems to be doing is to divide the publishers between and selling a fear, saying that, look, the smaller publishers are likely to be a raw deal and they'll be out of the business and all that, etc. How do you think the publishing domain is tackling there to counter this? And you are saying that most of these fears are ill-founded or not properly substantiated by fact. So how do you think are the publishers dealing with that kind of situation?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit there on
DJ,
my
can
end.
you put your thing on mute? DJ, okay, yeah. No, Taylor, what I'm asking is that when you mentioned about the fear that Google is trying
that tension,
that smaller publisher will get a raw deal, and which probably happened also in Australia, if I'm not wrong. How the large traditional publishers are dealing with, because you were saying that this is ill-founded. It's not correct interpretation of what the bill is likely to be.
Yeah. I mean, how have they responded to that accusation that it's going to disproportionately advantage them? I mean, some I think have, in some ways, it's not their fight to fight. I mean, I think Paul's organization has done a good job of sort of explaining how that isn't necessarily the case. And we'll hear about that, I'm sure, that this council sort of represents a whole range of news publishers.
Right.
I just don't think it's their role to make that case. It's the government's role, and it's the role of the independents to understand how these mechanisms work. And there's been a lot of, in my view, false information circulating about how this will play out. One of the realities, though, and this gets brought up a lot in the Canadian debate, and we saw it in the American debate too, is that this sort of proportional flow of funds that will go to the large publishers versus the small ones. So you often hear that sort of 70 or 80 or 90% of the funds will go to either legacy press or broadcasters. We can talk about inclusion of broadcasters, which has been a debate in Canada as well. But that is a result of the amount of journalism being done by the large publishers. So if you want a model that distributes resources in some way equitably in a prorated way based on how much journalism is being done, then just as a consequence of that, more money is going to go to the people who are doing more journalism. So if I have a small operation and I have 2 people, I am going to get a prorated proportional amount of that overall amount of money compared to a large publisher who might have 1,000 people. And that's just a reality of this mechanism. But that kind of thing gets used as well to pit them against each other. There's one attribute of this, though, is that, and I think Google picked up on this in a strategic, I guess, way, is that if you're a small publisher, you have in your DNA some degree of opposition to the big legacy actors. Like you've either left them, or you're trying to beat them, or you're frustrated at their market share, or that's many reasons you might in your DNA be oppositional to those large players. And they picked up on that and used that as a way of fracturing the debate amongst publishers.
Awesome.
Very wonderful. I think Taylor, it was a very insightful conversation. I think you answered a lot of questions on how the bill is different in Canada versus Australia. At the same time, how it builds upon the Australian bill and take it forward from there. Right. I think I had a couple of questions I wanted to understand. You mentioned how, let's say, the big tech is not taking the bill well, and the disposition isn't the best as you would have imagined, or one would imagine from, let's say, large players like these, right? So if you were to slip into the big tech shoes, right, what do you think would be the right way of conducting itself, which strengthen the relationship with the publishers, with the other stakeholders in the society, right? Because again, the truth is, both big tech and publishers need each other, right? So how do you think would be perhaps a way of conducting?
My goodness, that's a big question. So, look, I think you're entirely correct to point out that they both need each other. Publishers need, at the moment, these platforms for the distribution of their content and some of the engagement and even and monetization of their content, absolutely. But platforms also need access to reliable information. In my view, Facebook is greatly diminished if you cannot post and share reliable information of the world about the world within it. And Google search breaks. I mean, the very pretense of Google search is that it's providing you the best answers to questions about the world. So they both need them. The challenge in this ecosystem, as we've sort of monetized the platform ecosystem, is that most of that value of those products flows to the platforms, not to the publishers, and that's had a real consequence. In some ways, they've started down the path of doing the right thing, which is entering into these agreements or these sort of funding schemes to support journalism. So and in so doing, they've undermined one of their core arguments, which is that if they're forced to enter into these agreements, it will somehow sort of break the model of the free internet. But they've already entered into agreements with publishers around the world. So the challenge is they haven't done so in a way, in my view, that is as aligned with the democratic interest as it could be. They are choosing which publishers to enter into agreements with. The terms of those agreements are generally hidden. Sometimes they are based on particular types of content that platforms might want created. And that is not a great model. So I think, in my view, they could either support broad, equally distributed civic journalism funds, which is one model, or they can abide by these legislative efforts that are forcing them into more accountable deals with a broader range of publishers. If one were to see them do either, you could imagine a world in which some small percentage of global revenue of these platforms is distributed to the people and the organizations who create reliable information in the digital ecosystem. That may seem shocking to them initially, that 1 or 2 or 3% of their global revenue might go to that. I'm not sure that's a horrible bargain as a democratic citizen. I think they have benefited significantly from the organizations that create reliable information. I think as citizens of democratic societies, we have too. And we just need to ensure that they make it through this transition. So.
Nice. I think that's a good one. Yeah. Avinash, you want to do the next one?
You mentioned something that Facebook actually is removing the link of the publishers. So how do you think? I mean, what are the authorities doing meanwhile when the bill is getting in the process of getting passed? I mean, how are these kind of things dealt with?
Well, they haven't done it yet. They're threatening to do it.
They're threatening to do it. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, they're threatening to do it. And I mean, I'm not sure honestly, I'm not sure what it looks like if they do it. I think it's probably fairly easy for them to do it with a clear list of publishers. I assume they would just block links to those publishers. The thing is that the bill applies to a very large range of organizations, though. And so maybe in one market you can do it, but it will be very difficult to implement in many markets together. And what does it do to their product, frankly? I mean, I don't know. Facebook newsfeed or Instagram are all having their challenges at the moment. And if you turn off the ability of people to share news content, I'm not sure what that strategically does, honestly, to their product, but right. I guess that's not my business.
Right.
Taylor, I had there's another question coming from our audiences. You mentioned how the various nuances of the Canadian bill, which intends to define the distribution and also bring it let's say, in public domain and generate more transparency on how, let's say, deals are constructed, right? So is there some sort of a formula which sort of helps define the equitable distribution for publishers from this big tech? Is there some sort of, is that something that has been able to do that, so that there is essentially complete, I mean, everybody is winning in this one, and there is no, let's say, one publisher, and it solves the problem of big versus small publishers as well?
In terms of a formula for the distribution of the funds?
Yeah.
There's not a exact formula. There is, I think, an expectation that the mechanism will lead to greater equality amongst the deals, because you have some degree of transparency over the nature of deals others have received. So if you know in broad terms what your competitors have received in their deals, because that's been reported in aggregate by the regulator, that when you enter into negotiation, you're starting at that baseline, as opposed to this environment right now where nobody knows what anybody else is getting, which further empowers the actor that's doing the distribution, which is the market imbalance that sort of caused this whole problem to begin with. So that act of transparency, even if not full details of commercial deals, is immensely important to the types of deals others will get. Now, that being said, I mean, I think Paul can talk a little bit about sort of what certain collectives might do in terms of coming up with their own formulas for the distribution of those resources. But that's private market actors coming up with those terms and that distribution on their own. That's not written into the legislation. The option is, I mean, a lot of people in Canada have said, and you see this debate all the time in other jurisdictions, is that the better option to the bargaining code is a central fund that distributes the money through some sort of formula. And in an ideal world, that, in my view, that might be better. The challenge is, and there's many challenges with it, but the one that often doesn't get discussed is that that is a much more significant intervention in the journalistic market by the government than the code. So people who are concerned about the hand of government deciding how journalism resources are distributed, that one is much more assertive, because the government has to decide the terms of that fund itself.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to come in here, but thank you, Professor Owen, for sharing all these thoughts, and thank you, Mr. Jain and Mr. Pandey for all the great questions. We're just quickly moving on to the next session, and we'll be taking on more questions, which the entire panel will be answering towards the end. So with that, I want to thank you, Professor Owen, and I want to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Paul Deegan, to take this discussion forward. Quickly, Mr. Deegan is President and Chief Executive of News Media Canada, the voice of the print and digital media industry in Canada, representing hundreds of trusted news titles. Over to you, Mr. Deegan.
Great. Thank you so much, Rohail, and greetings from Toronto, Canada, where it's, I believe we're something like 23 degrees colder than where you are in Delhi right now. So it's a little chilly here, but pleasure to be with you. We certainly have, many ties between Canada and India. We have 1.4 million Indo-Canadians, and we've got lots of educational exchanges and things like that. So I think it's, this is a really opportune forum for us to learn from each other. So it's a great pleasure to be with you. In terms of the just where we're coming from, so News Media Canada, we represent about 570 titles across Canada. And just to give you a sort of a sense of the breadth of the membership, I would say roughly a third are very large publications, whether an individual title or large chains. We've got another third, which are, I would say, sort of mid-sized chains and larger independents. And then we've got another third, which are really truly independents, very small. They may have a few employees. Some of them are literally, some sort of mom and pop type enterprises that are producing, a newspaper that serves a community of 1,200 or something like that. So we go from the very large to the very small. I guess just, philosophically, we all obviously believe that a strong independent press is vital to our democracy. And if you look at sort of the world that we're living in today, the need for trusted journalism has never been higher. We live in a world where, lots of fake news, politicians saying that everything is fake. We have this sort of citizen publishing, which is good and healthy, but in a world where everyone is a publisher, there needs to be an understanding that with being a publisher comes a level of responsibility, and that responsibility is first and foremost to. Sorry, I'm getting a background or no. First and foremost, that we have a responsibility to our readers and that our reporting is honest, that it's accurate, that it's fair, and that it's balanced. And to produce that, real journalism costs real money. And to create that quality content, we must be commercially viable. As all of you are too well aware, the business model has been disrupted. To give you a sense in Canada on sort of revenue decline, that for newspapers, revenue probably peaked a decade or so ago at about $5 billion. Today, it's roughly $1 billion. And in that same time, the revenues for Google and Meta in Canada would have gone from, let's say, $1 billion or so 10 years ago to roughly $10 billion today. So there's really been this inverse between sort of the revenue of publishers and the platforms. And we've obviously, as you've seen in India as well, but the revenue has not rebounded from the pre-pandemic levels. So that's been a real problem, especially for a lot of our print titles. And as we look at this, I think competition authorities around the world are coming to terms with the dominance of Google and Meta in the ad market, but not enough has been done to address it. So I think, in Canada and around the world, essentially what we have is a market failure, which is having a really devastating impact on content and on local news. In Canada, we've seen hundreds of news outlets have been shuttered over the past decade. We've had thousands of journalists, not just in print media, but in radio and television, have been let go. So it's really a very difficult market for news. But at the same time, the content that our journalists produce has great value to our readers and to the web giants. So despite the challenging circumstances, I think everyone's really done a terrific job in terms of producing high quality news. Now, obviously for that news, our belief is that we should be compensated by the platforms. And, there is a significant imbalance of power between the tech giants and the Canadian news outlets. And news outlets around the world. So we wanted the government to act, and the government itself has wanted to act, and I think has been noodling this for at least 5 years or so, trying to figure out the best way to do this. So the question is, how do you do it? So as Taylor mentioned, one of the ways is simply to tax it and putting the money in a fund. We have concerns with that in terms of the level of government intervention, where you essentially are getting into more of a situation where you've got the government picking winners and losers. So we don't see that as a viable option. The second would be to go the copyright route, which is long and complex. And to be honest, if that were to take, 5 or 10 years to deal with, we're not going to have enough publishers around if we wait that long. And then the third way is essentially to, try to address it through competition policy. And that's essentially where we've landed. So in the summer of 2021, the governing party, which is the Liberal Party, in their election platform, they proposed that we follow the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which was still in its infancy at that point. Most of the other parties in Parliament were in broad agreement on it. One of the parties was looking, I think, more in terms of going the copyright route, but generally, I think there was reasonable consensus that this was a good approach. So we were very pleased earlier this year. Pablo Rodriguez, who's the Minister of Canadian Heritage, introduced C-18, the Online News Act, in the House of Commons. And this legislation is used for a number of reasons. First of all, the need for strong independent local press has never been greater. It keeps us connected, whether it's covering city hall, provincial governments, territorial governments, our national government. It's very important that we hold these institutions accountable. And we actually surveyed Canadians a number of months ago, and we asked one of our research firms, and this is a poll that we've paid for and sponsored, what they think about the importance of local media. And there was high agreement. Something like 90% of Canadians said that it's important that our local media outlets survive. And about 80% thought that some form of legislation was needed to address this. The power imbalance between the platforms and the publishers is huge. And just to give you a sense of it, the combined market cap of Google and Meta, and I know it's been going down in particular on the Meta side, but it's about 3/4 of Canada's annual GDP. So that's just like these are massive companies. With the prospect of our parliamentarians acting, as Taylor mentioned, Google and Meta started doing content licensing agreements with publishers, and effectively what's happened is they're picking winners and losers. They picked about a dozen publishers or so, and that's created a real problem because we've got sort of a situation now essentially of haves and have-nots among our publishers. And, that's very, very troubling. It's not fair. And we're at a point now where we've got, a lot of publishers that are left out in the cold. And that's obviously not healthy for the media ecosystem overall. What the legislation does is it allows us, as Taylor mentioned, to negotiate collectively. And currently our competition laws would bar us from forming a collective. But given the overwhelming power imbalance, we feel that we'll be in a stronger bargaining position if we stand together. It also includes an enforcement mechanism, final offer arbitration, ensuring that all parties put their best offer forward and then the arbitrator picks one or the other. And it's that hammer of arbitration that really incents both sides to reach a fair settlement on their own. As you know, in Australia, nothing has actually gone to arbitration. I don't know if anything actually ever will in Canada once this legislation is passed, but it basically forces both parties to get to the table and to be serious. I know you heard from Rod Sims recently, and if you look at sort of the benefit that the news media bargaining code has accrued to the news businesses, it's something in the neighborhood of $200 million, and it's not some of these platforms will tell you, all the money went to Rupert Murdoch, that basically there's no money for smaller entities. But if you look at groups like Country Press Australia, and I know you heard from Paul Thomas, and he led that negotiation. They seem very happy with what they were able to achieve. And then more recently, we had a group of 24 smaller Australian publishers that came together. And it's interesting. It was actually a private charitable foundation that negotiated on their behalf, and they were able to conclude agreements. As Taylor mentioned, our legislation is, it builds on the success of the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, but it's also different. So I'll highlight just a few that certainly caught our attention. One is that in Australia, in terms of who makes the determination of which platforms are subject to the Act, that's made by the minister. In Canada, that's made by the CRTC, which is this broadcast regulator that that Taylor referred to. So that sort of takes the decision away from the politicians and puts it to an arm's length regulator. So we think that is certainly a welcome development. The entitlement to remuneration is also much more clear in our legislation. It refers to fair compensation for the news content that is made in Australia. Made available. And in Australia, the statute is actually not as explicit on that. It's also interesting. It says that an appropriate portion of the remuneration must be used by the news business to create news content, and there's no such provision in the Australian legislation. And again, we think that's a positive development. And we also have an explicit exemption from the Competition Act in our legislation. The Australian legislation is silent on that point, but again, we think that that's important. It also gives the CRTC, this broadcast regulator, powers to publish non-confidential information, to produce an annual report about the deals, to basically show sort of what has happened in aggregate. And again, we think that that's actually a constructive development. There's lots of demands for transparency. I would say there's not full public transparency on commercial deals, but there's a level of transparency which we think is appropriate and balanced. Now, when it comes to, once the legislation passes, and we're hoping that the legislation will pass this spring, it should. We have a bicameral system in Canada, and it should finish up with the House of Commons Heritage Committee, either actually potentially today or next week. And then from there, it will go to the full House and then to the Senate, where we'll expect, sort of further amendments. But the question really becomes, once this legislation is passed, how do you sort of make sure that everyone benefits equally from the settlement? And so we have come together with another organization, the National Ethnic Press and Media Council, and we've devised what we think is a very simple formula, which is and one of the reasons that we came to this is the smaller publishers, who don't have any sort of corporate overhead, were concerned that effectively they would be subsidizing the larger publishers that have, a law department, an HR department, and all of the sort of corporate overhead that is unrelated to the production of journalism. So we've come up with a formula which we think works and satisfies the need of everybody and is fair to everyone. And it's simply this: that we basically each publisher will submit to a law firm or an accounting firm on sort of a black box basis their investment in newsroom salary and wages. We'll take that. Whatever we can negotiate from Google and Meta, will then basically divide that up on a pro rata basis. So we're rewarding investment in newsroom, and we think that's really the fair way to go. From our perspective, this is very good legislation, and but it can also be made better. And there's this process that I refer to in terms of the Heritage Committee in the House of Commons. They're going through that right now. We've proposed a number of amendments to the bill, and I'll just walk you through them very quickly. The legislation right now really only applies to those publishers that have 2 or more arm's length employees. And again, as I mentioned, I don't have the exact number, but let's say 100 of our members are essentially, very small sort of mom and pop shops. So we want the owner operator, who is a journalist, to count towards that minimum. So that, as Taylor mentioned, that's been approved or amended by the committee. We'll see, it's still got a ways to go through Parliament. We'll see where it lands, but we think that's a very important improvement on the legislation. The second thing is we've got there's essentially 2 qualifications to be eligible. One is something called a Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization, which involves a number of criteria. You've got to have more than 2 arm's length employees. You've got to adhere to editorial standards, etc. On the other criteria, which just said you have to have 2 employees, there was no reference to editorial standards. So we've suggested language. Other parties have as well. Google has made this point. So the committee has now come up with language that has, a level of sort of editorial standards, which we think is important. Finally, we want some sort of shot clock mechanism in the legislation. So right now it basically says something like, that, this process will be done in a reasonable period of time, but what's reasonable to one person may not be reasonable to another. So we proposed, timing around the actual negotiation, around mediation, and around arbitration, and we think that's an improvement to the bill. I should also just add, it's great to see that others are picking up on this. Obviously, Australia really sort of set the mark. Canada is following. I know you have great interest in this in India. We've seen New Zealand, and we're very close to a group of publishers throughout the Americas, and they're looking at Canada very closely and really hoping that this happens. We're also obviously all looking at the Americans in terms of the JCPA. I know that wasn't part of the defense bill, or it was sort of removed from the defense bill, but we'll see where that lands. But again, we're hopeful for our friends in the US that they can get that done in this lame duck session of Congress before the new Congress comes in. I guess just a couple of final thoughts. Content licensing agreements are obviously helpful, they're needed, they're valuable, but they're not a silver bullet. We have a number of supports in Canada. As Taylor mentioned, we've got the Canadian Journalism Labour Tax Credit, which provides a credit of 25% of newsroom salary and wages up to a certain cap. That's been very, very important to us. We also have the Local Journalism Initiative, which actually funds journalist positions in news deserts and areas of news poverty throughout the country. That's been a terrific program, especially in sort of more rural and remote areas. And we have a number of other supports as well. But fundamentally, however, publishers really have to address their business model and succeed in sort of this new digital world. One of the lessons I think of recent years for publishers in Canada and everywhere else in the world is we cannot cut our way to growth. We've seen attempts at that sort of over the past decade, and in many cases cutting expenses has been necessary, but it's not going to get us over the hump in terms of where we need to be. So in this world of declining ad dollars, we have to invest in quality journalism that people are willing to pay for on a subscription basis. Our citizens need more news and less noise. I used to be on the board of directors of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and their tagline is, "As journalism goes, so goes democracy." And I would say that those words are really much more than a tagline. They're really a fundamental truth. And we need an informed population and a vibrant media to keep institutions in check and strengthen our democracy. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Paul. I think my colleague Puneet has a question for you. So,
yeah, lovely. I think Paul, it was you answered most of the questions. Actually, you explained how the economic imbalances has panned out over the years, and hence why we are where we are, and the urgent need to address this economic imbalances, right? So I just want to understand and you did mention how there are still a slew of measures that even after this code, which they would need to do. So how do you think this sort of bill would pave the way for publishers to, let's say, revisit or reimagine their business models, and hence which can be in line with the social media world we are living in, and yet addresses the core journalism ethos and the true and the clear value to society that we serve to?
Yeah. So I think one of the issues is just because of the cuts that have been made, if you look at, sort of a printed newspaper, page counts are down, publishers that, let's say used to publish a Monday edition aren't doing that anymore. So the quality of the product in some cases has gone down. And, once you sort of lower the quality of your product, you just get into this death spiral because there's so much information out there that's, free, right? And so why would someone pay for a product that is not high quality? So that's definitely an issue. I think, what we've heard from Australia, seems to be that the negotiation is really based on newsroom, salaries. So essentially funding journalists. And, from our perspective, that's the way to go. The labor tax credit that Taylor and I referred to is the same thing. So I think really investing in newsroom is the way that's going to get us over. Like it's ultimately, I think we are going to continue to be in this decline on advertising, and until competition authorities around the world can sort of figure out how to kind of address that, through antitrust and things like that, until that's done, it's got to be content and it's got to be subscription revenue. I think that's really the only way to get us over, because the ad dollars are just, they're not there.
Great. Thanks, Paul. On that note, I hand it over to Sue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jain. Thank you for this wonderful session. What enlightening points you made there. Of course, we're getting flooded with questions, which we'll keep at the end. And please keep these conversations going on Twitter, #DNPA, E4M DNPA Dialogues. So we quickly want to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Courtney Raj. Dr. Raj is a PhD fellow at UCLA's Technology, Law and Policy Institute and the US representative for Article 19. I want to hand it over to you, Dr. Raj. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to take a step back. I recently authored a report called Making Big Tech Pay for the News They Use. And I did a global review of all of the legislation and regulation being proposed or even discussed around the world. And so I want to talk about the different types of approaches, as well as the specific issues that I would suggest policymakers should be considering. And so with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and hopefully it will show you the slideshow. All right. Are you able to see the slideshow? Excellent. Great. Okay. So first of all, I'm not going to spend time on the context. You all know this. We all know this. But I think that we'll get to the point about how this context ends up getting interpreted in these different legislative frameworks. So there's an overarching aim to improve media viability and sustainability. Obviously, that's critical in democracies and elsewhere. And ultimately, the goal is to generate new revenues or subsidies for news outlets. And those end up having different types of solutions in terms of the policy solutions. Some of the key considerations that policymakers want to be thinking about is how to establish the evidence of the link between traffic and revenue. And that's honestly one of the things that we just really don't know. Looking at self-regulatory structures versus government decision-making and distribution, and kind of the broader infrastructure that exists in the digital economy. And I'm going to discuss that at the end, because I think, it's great to talk about pursuing certain approaches, but you need to make sure that you have the legal, the regulatory, the trust infrastructure at the basis of that. So there are essentially 5 main policy areas that these various different approaches kind of pick and choose from. So one is taxation. And a key assumption kind of underpinning that is that, the revenues that are accruing to these tech companies are not being adequately, obviously, allocated to news outlets that are producing, as has been mentioned, really high quality content. And I would just say that this idea that, Facebook keeps saying, oh, only 3% of traffic is to news. I think we have to disabuse them of that notion. And it disregards the fact that they are funding fact checking a lot on their platform. So obviously they want high quality news. So we need to get rid of that rhetoric. I think we still do not have good evidence, and this is where the media can come in about the actual link there, and I'll get into that in a moment. So essentially, policymakers have coalesced around interventions that focus on taxation, intellectual property, competition law, which means giving people different bargaining rights, requiring platforms to pay licensing fees, requiring them to negotiate for that, taxing digital advertising and using the resulting revenues to subsidize publishers, and subsidies paid directly or indirectly to news outlets, for example, through citizen vouchers or tax credits, and mandating transparency from platforms. So with respect to the ad tech ecosystem, I think as India and your competition authority or DNPA's submission emphasized, the opacity and complexity of the ad tech supply chain compounds the difficulty of publishers who want to create these revenue streams. And again, we just do not really have good evidence about the link. There are a couple of studies right after some new legislation was passed in Europe, but we don't have long-term, we don't have comprehensive studies. So I am just going to note that there is this labyrinth of data management and kind of different platforms and exchanges that are involved in the ad tech ecosystem, which means that publishers get a reduced portion of the money spent by advertisers. There's a lack of data and traceability to even know where a lot of that money is going. And one study found that the UK regulator estimated that on average, more than 35% of advertising value went to intermediaries rather than publishers, and a third of that was unaccounted for. So obviously there are many. I think this also points to the fact that we should be looking to the advertising industry as here you have the advertising industry involved, which is great, as an ally in this effort. So if we're looking at one of the approaches, it's about leveling the playing field, and so you have the US, Canada, Australia trying to increase the news media bargaining power. This means removing anti-competition barriers to collective action, as you know. But there is another approach to antitrust kind of pro-competition interventions, which is aimed at reducing information asymmetries, or the dominance in particular aspects of the marketplace. And so these can focus on algorithmic transparency and increasing transparency into the digital advertising market. So I think we want to see transparency as a specific type of intervention as well. As the first country, as has been mentioned, Australia has really kind of set the bar, but also highlighted some of the issues and criticisms with the law. It's, as was mentioned, that's benefiting large news outlets rather than small. That may or may not be a concern. That is something definitely in the United States that helped, I think, kill the bill yesterday that was put into the National Defense Authorization Act. But I think we have to ask ourselves, why don't we also want to support large news organizations? And if you can be proactive about that, that might be helpful, because actually in Brazil, Facebook was able to align with small independent publishers and kill their effort there to have a similar type of approach. On the positive side, I think Australia explicitly included public service media in its framework, which is something that has garnered support in Canada. And in exchange, that public service media agreed to spend that money on journalists in rural and regional areas. So I think this is another way you can look at this type of work to accomplish multiple goals. For example, addressing news deserts and serving underserved or marginalized populations. The use of these mandatory arbitration clauses is another kind of commonality that we see in here. This idea that there are anti-retaliation provisions are another common feature that are aimed at creating a more equal playing ground and insulating news organizations from platform pressure. So I think Taylor mentioned earlier that the Canada's draft bill would allow news organizations to actually join a negotiated deal after the fact, which is great because maybe your news organization didn't exist yet or didn't know about how to join or wanted to see what was going to happen before joining in. So I think that's really helpful. We have two main pieces of legislation here in the US that are aimed at supporting local news. One is the Journalist Competition and Preservation Act, JCPA, which you heard was just not passed in the NDAA yesterday, and the US Local Journalism Sustainability Act. So the JCPA is an antitrust collective bargaining approach. The Journalism Sustainability Act is about giving credits and to news consumers to choose how they allocate that, and then to credit taxes for local journalism. So the key issues that all of these approaches take are figuring out really at the core of it, the definition of news publisher or the beneficiary of this legislation. So all of these approaches raise fundamental questions about how to define news media beneficiaries, how to distribute benefits, and who makes the decision about how. And so to this end, it's really important that policymakers need to be clear about the objective of their intervention and their theory of change. And that they try to create processes that insulate news media from political interference and which don't further dependency on platforms for funding or survival, because again, we might see that these platforms don't become the most important. So think about how to do this without being very specific on platforms. And we have to be realistic about the risk of capture. So the risk of capture is higher in countries with high levels of cronyism or political interference in the news industry, or low levels of press freedom more broadly. And as we know, governments around the world have a track record of using their budgetary influence via taxation, subsidies, government advertising, et cetera, to influence or capture the media. So any sort of legislation needs to be designed in a way to preserve editorial independence. And it stands to reason that the further that the intervention is from the content related products, and the greater the independence of the mechanisms for defining beneficiaries is from the government, the lower the risk of media capture. So, definitions, again, are a key focal point. Here are some of you can see on the screen, some of the issues that each piece of legislation needs to address. Defining press publishers, how is that done? I, in my report, have a chart showing kind of how these are done by different types of government interventions. Because, by definition, if you adopt an ancillary copyright or any sort of beneficiary, you're going to have to define who that is. So these decisions can be made by government. They can be made by self-regulatory associations like journalism associations, et cetera. I think the idea is don't put that decision in any one specific body. If there are multiple news, press councils, digital news associations, professional bodies, that's a great way to go. Or you can put that into the hands of citizens and individual taxpayers to decide essentially by where their vouchers go or where their tax credits are spent. And of course, one of the things that differentiates these approaches is whether or not they require transparency into the deals. I think one of the best practices that is emerging and which we saw added into the JCPA is to make sure that at least there's some minimal reporting. I don't think we want to get into details here, but there should be at least some minimal reporting to a central authority so it's easier to provide oversight and review of that. So if you look at the two US approaches, the JCPA and the Sustainability Act, you can see that they're taking different approaches. The idea of providing tax credits, that could be, or vouchers to citizens, can be a really interesting intervention, because that could accomplish more than just the goal of improving news media sustainability. It might also encourage people to read the news, to engage with the news, and increase media literacy, which is another public policy goal in many cases. And so you can see how these different, these two acts have chosen to define journalism, define thresholds, and that's something that, policymakers are going to need to consider. What is the regional requirement? Is it about where the staff is located? Is it about what the audiences that are served? Is there a size requirement? So another intervention that I think has gotten a little bit less attention is transparency interventions, and this is designed at addressing information asymmetries. So greater transparency would serve a broad range of goals, including media sustainability, which also means that you might be able to get more support from across different communities. So there is really no agreement about the level of transparency that should be required with respect to licensing deals, as you heard earlier from Taylor. But we do see that, there does seem to be this trend towards requiring some sort of central reporting. And you can also look at transparency as dealing with algorithmic transparency. First, advertising, I mentioned there's a lot of seepage. So improving transparency around ad tech would improve that. Algorithmic transparency, you see that in the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. That is around the idea that the decisions that the platforms make have a very real economic impact on news organizations. And so they should be advised in advance. I think that we call this algorithmic transparency, but it could also be, in some cases, it's policy transparency and advance notice. So if you're going to pivot away from video or pivot to video, there should be transparency and accountability. Of course, we know that Facebook ended up lying about that. So sorry, little trigger happy here. Okay. And then there's some aspect of transparency which we have not addressed in many of these frameworks, which is other types of platform support to news media. So I think it would be helpful to think about how there could be also reporting requirements for platforms to at least provide a basic centralized information into the news organizations that they're providing funding to, again, to increase transparency. And in general, there should be a principle that if you're doing independent, good journalism, you're going to be transparent about your ownership and your funding on that. So, we mentioned earlier, I think Paul mentioned, the adoption of copyright laws. And so there is this idea of, rethinking intellectual property rights to include copyright for news snippets and headlines, and thinking about where to draw the line with fair use. On the one hand, headlines, photos, and snippets that show up may drive traffic and potentially generate revenue, referral traffic, as opposed to direct or organic traffic, which is often more valuable. In Europe, they have already adopted this through the EU copyright directive, and there's been a lot of up in arms about, this is a link tax, this is going to break the internet. The internet does still work in Europe, so good news. We have not seen that this breaks the internet, so this is another thing that regulators are looking at. The US, however, just decided that the Copyright Office said that we would not be getting a new collective ancillary copyright law. So I think there's still a lot of concern about that. So this is an area where more evidence would be helpful. And one of the things that you have to think about with ancillary copyright laws is you need to have industry associations and collecting agencies that can implement a monitoring and payment distribution system, which requires transparency and trust to function. So even where there are adequate publishers associations and existing royalties rights management associations, there must be authorities with the competence and the capacity to monitor and enforce compliance. And the fact is, in a lot of countries, that doesn't exist. It seems like India probably does have that sort of basis, so that might be helpful. So as I mentioned, my report really was looking at how possible are these approaches that are coming from the so-called global north, the countries that often have a seat at the table. How can they be used by the majority world, which is also called the global south? So I think, these overarching challenges are the lack of information and access to data to inform this policy making. So it'd be helpful if regulators could come up with a common set of standards around what type of information should be collected. And that shouldn't be just, one country or the other. The lack of influence and market share, that's not an issue for India. You guys are in a really good position because you have a really important market share and therefore more influence. As I mentioned, there is this varying regulatory capacity and often a knowledge and skills gap in government. So also congrats to you for doing this briefing and really, taking the time to try to figure out, what are these different models? And then, of course, the institutional configuration, the legal, financial, and technical infrastructure. That means you need IP and copyright law. Where does that fit into other priorities? These professional media industry and publisher associations and collecting societies are a really important component that we don't often talk about. And so you need to look at what systems do you have in place? And then again, these systems to monitor. And then I have some recommendations, but I'm going to end there and stop sharing. And just to say, I think that if you look at all of these various different types of approaches, one of the things that can be helpful is if we think globally on the transparency aspect and data needs to actually collaborate on a global common framework, which might help then many countries pursue this and show some level of consensus around there. And I think with that, I'll just stop and open for any questions.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have the question and answer round now. And Avinash ji and Puneet ji, you can start, and then I will, have the rest of the questions.
I will ask just one question, and any three of you panelists can answer that. That we spoke about the importance of local media. We spoke about the importance of conventional media and having a fair share of the revenue. And these changes that is happening in our world currently is done through legislations. Is there a way that we can convince the big tech saying that it's not in our mutual interest to keep fighting? And can we arrive at some revenue share or some understanding which should be universally applicable globally, irrespective of the platform?
You want me to take that? Sure. So I guess what I would say is, I think it's helpful if we move to some sort of global standard, but I think ultimately we do need to have legislation, to make sure that there's sort of the teeth behind this. We've got, right now, at least from our experience, we've seen this sort of, basically picking the large players and excluding a lot of the small, and that's not healthy. So, I believe we do need the legislation. I think, if we could move to some sort of, model globally, and I think Australia has provided a good basis for the rest of us to build on. And as Courtney just said, I think, we need this sort of global cooperation. We're all learning from each other. We're still in the very early days of this, but I do think that, voluntary agreements aren't going to cut it, that we do need legislation globally.
All right, I have some questions here, from the audience. Let me start. So it's open. It's an open forum here. So anyone, wishes to answer is to all of you. First question is, how can the interests of smaller media houses and big media houses, who are often competing, be brought together on matters concerning big tech?
Sorry,
So
can
who
you
wants
repeat
to?
that?
Okay, Dr. Courtney, Raj, yes.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question is, how can the interests of smaller media houses and big media houses, who are often competing, be brought together on matters concerning big tech?
I mean, I think if I may intervene on that, I mean, I think one of the key factors should be that, the news industry needs to be focused on coming together with these proposals and being part of the discussions and leading those discussions. And, there need to be, I think, fora of trust and confidential fora for large and small media organizations to collaborate. And I do think that part of this, I think both as Paul and Taylor alluded to, this isn't just about news revenues. It really is about a fundamental pillar of democracy and a fundamental part of the infrastructure of democracy. And so, if we can get beyond kind of the parochial individualized interest of any one company and try to really make this about more than just that, so that the big publishers, I do think, need to be more explicit about their recognition that, what they get, they need to think more broadly about the community of media in the country, not just about themselves. And I would say we need to do this at a global level as well. So as we're thinking about some sort of kind of global standards, I mean, the fact is, like, Botswanan media or media in Lebanon are never going to have the influence or power to really put in place any sort of meaningful legislative framework. And so we need US, Europe, Canada, India, these influential, powerful actors to really do a good job of designing their frameworks so that there is a template there and it can potentially provide a broader framework for media globally as well.
Great. And thanks, Dr. Courtney.
Yeah.
I think this was a very engaging discussion. We understood from how the economic balances in the publisher and big tech relationship, and how I think the Canadian bill is building from Australian bill to address this, and the actions in the US to also address the same. I think on that note, I just wanted to. I think Dr. Courtney, Albert research to understand the blueprint. You literally gave a blueprint of how, let's say, India could go about it. That was, again, very, very insightful. On that note, I will pass on to Ruhail. If you have any questions, and a lot of questions are still there, please go ahead. I know we are under pressure.
We have exactly 3 minutes. So one final question to Avinash ji. Maybe Puneet, you can also join us there. What is the way ahead for Indian publishers regarding this, publisher big tech equation? A quick concluding remark from both of you.
Yeah, I think if I can go ahead and Avinash, please add. I think as we understand from developments all across the world, one, of course, there are, let's say, economic imbalance that must be addressed. Right. So while I think we should continue to engage both with big tech as well as the other government participants to understand, come to a common ground. But at the same time, what I'm hearing is our panelists say that perhaps a legislative support is important to address the imbalance. Without that, it's and a voluntary one may be limited to solve the challenge at hand.
I would add one in 20 seconds. News channel format.
So Dr. Courtney wanted to add something. Dr. Courtney.
Yeah, I would add one thing, which is I believe UNESCO is coming up with a model regulatory framework broader than this, but it addresses that. I do think that having a global model that represents multiple independent regulatory input would be really helpful, because that could help insulate legislative efforts from the type of intervention that killed, for example, the JCPA yesterday, the efforts of platforms to divide the news industry if there are these global standards. So I would suggest one thing that Indian publishers could do is to contribute and to think about how can we pull together a global coalition to work on a model regulatory framework. Look at the UNESCO thing, and then of course there's the OECD.
Right. I'm sorry to intervene here. We're just out of time, and I have to thank all of you for taking out time and showing us, what the way forward looks on the big tech publisher equation, and how we can, make it even a balanced affair. Of course, these conversations will continue, but a lot of takeaways from today's, discussion, and it's all there on the social media. People are sending us questions. We'll surely run them past you and ask you for your responses. But thank you, everyone, for making this happen, for joining this. Thank you, DNPA and Exchange for Media, for making these conversations happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khatni. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.